and welcome to another episode of Economy and Markets TV, the show that takes you around the world of economic and financial news. I'm your host, Dave Okenquist, Senior Research Analyst here at Dent. It is Friday, which means it's time for the regular weekly dive into the news of the week, which means I bring on Rodney Johnson. Rodney, good morning.
Morning, Dave.
Rodney is, of course, the senior editor and co-founder of Dent Research. In this show, we highlight the most important news items of the week, and we try to keep things under 2 minutes. And to that end, if Rodney goes over 2 minutes, I'm going to ding him with this bell. Are you confident in your ability to stay within the time frame, Rodney?
I think I can make it happen.
Okay. Well, let's get into our first topic, which is oil, which we also talked about last week a bit. In the OECD, which is the Organization of Economically Developed Countries, their oil inventory for that whole block hit a 3-year low. This is about, if you don't know this group, it's about 35, I believe it's 35 advanced economies, but it doesn't include the BRIC countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, but most of the advanced economies that you would imagine. So that's just basically the developed world, the biggest consumers of oil, and suddenly their inventory has dropped. We're seeing rising prices, Rodney, but what's making inventory so low?
Well, it's a continuing thing. I mean, the OECD is called the country club of countries, which you might expect because it is the richest ones, as you noticed.
Yeah.
What we've done is eaten through the inventories that we all have. And so we're sitting, I want to say, about 5 million barrels below, or 20 million barrels. It's a small number in terms of world inventory, but you got to think of it in terms of math. And so what happens is, as we've produced a lot of oil and had a lot in inventory over the last 3, 4, 5 years, then the average has actually walked up because, of course, we had a lot. And so as we've eaten through some of the oversupply, because OPEC and its agreeing nations have cut up production by a couple 100,000 barrels a day.
And that was something you didn't think was going to happen, right? You didn't think they were
think they could. I knew they were going to make the agreement, but they have cheated every other time they've made an agreement. So I figured they would just cheat, right?
Yeah, be who you are.
Yeah. They held to it. It pushed up prices. Inventory came down. And so you also have the Venezuelans who are producing less. You have the possibility, although it's not part of this measure, of the Iranians producing less in the future. And so inventories came down as that average was coming up. And so we came through it. And so we did eat through the oversupply. It's actually really good news because now that we produce a lot of oil here in the United States, thanks to fracking, we're the beneficiaries.
Yeah.
And so when you look at higher oil prices, a little bit more pain at the pump, as we described last week. But you know what? As long as we're not going to 100, 120, which would start to impede a lot of economic growth, we're getting the benefit of this higher price. So it is what it is. We'll take it.
Yeah. And do you expect with some of those, the self-imposed quota, and this, like you said, the stuff going on with Venezuela and Iran, are these countries going to maybe look and say, hey, maybe we'll buy from the Americans? We're going to see more of that in the future, Rodney?
Well, they don't have a choice. Oil is a fungible commodity. You can, as long as you stay within grade of light sweet or heavy sour or whatever, any barrel can be substituted for another barrel.
Yeah.
And so when you're looking at global supply, it's not as if you say, hey, I only want to buy from this group or that group. You kind of buy whatever's out there to match what your demand is. And so I don't think anybody's saying, hey, let's not buy from them because we don't like them very much.
Yeah.
The only reason people aren't buying from the Iranians or will not is because we're putting on sanctions for the money system, which is a really big hammer.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we're going to stay international for our next topic. It's really, it's again, some of these first quarter GDP blues. So Japan and Germany came in. Germany, their GDP disappointed, just 0.3% for the quarter. That's non-annualized. And then Japan goes negative for the first time in 2 years, just minus, they contracted 0.6%, which is annualized. So they're sort of just kind of sitting there around zero. Now, Germany, let's start with Germany, Rodney. They're the strongest economy in the Eurozone. This result probably has policymakers a bit nervous, right?
It does, but it's more bankers. And so Germany coming in 0.3 annualized, it makes it a 1.2% GDP growth. As you said, they are the largest, strongest economy in the Eurozone. And so it actually pulls in the European Central Bank. And so the European Central Bank is still printing over $30 billion a month to buy bonds.
Yeah.
And they are holding their short-term lending facility at negative 40 basis points, which is still kind of crazy to get your head around that they're charging people to deposit money. And so the thought was that they would stop printing as much money in September, maybe stop printing altogether, and would start raising interest rates, maybe not at the end of this year, but next year. At least get back to zero, right? Back to zero would be good.
Yeah.
This throws that into question. because it speaks to more modest growth. It speaks to perhaps muted inflation, which is going to keep the ECB involved. And as they're doing that, what they're doing is weakening the euro. That's the whole game here. And of course, Germany's a big exporter.
Right.
And so they want to keep the euro weaker so that exports are cheaper, which means the dollar gets stronger. And so you have to kind of follow the bouncing ball along here, that Germany's weak GDP actually flows back to a stronger U.S. dollar.
Right, and I think the U.S. probably doesn't want the dollar to strengthen too much because it wants to be able to export its own thing. So yeah, you got the interplay of things. Now looking at Japan, they had 2 years of positive growth and now back to negative. And if policymakers in Europe are nervous, maybe in Japan they are suicidal.
Well, at least they can say they've been here before, right?
Yeah.
The headline went something like, ends the longest growth streak in 28 years or something. And what it means is, since basically 1990, the Japanese haven't been able to put together 2 years of GDP growth until the last 2 years, and now it's over.
Yeah.
And so think about that. We had the incredible roaring 1990s. I mean, it was on fire, right? The longest expansion in history. The downturn 2000, 2001, and then basically 03 to 08. And then, of course, the downturn, and then back up again after that for almost a decade. So they're back to where they've been, and it's because they're an aging society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at the chart of Japan GDP growth, and it's just not impressive. It's a very misleading headline. Longest growth streak in 28 years. All right, well, that's enough for that. And our next topic, speaking of an aging society, this is what happens when your birth rate starts to tank. We got news about the U.S. of the lowest birth rate in over a century. There was, let's say, 3.85 million births, which by numbers is the lowest in 30 years. I had an E&M, Economy and Markets, come out this past Tuesday on this very topic. This also focused on the phenomenon of British virgins and Japanese virgins, and this sort of thing is just not going to help birth rates. I think eventually, I don't want to get too much into my piece here, but Ronnie, what's your take on this? We've got another sort of bad news on birth rates.
You start going on like that, Dave, I'm going to have to get my own bell so I can ding you. Right. I mean, we're going to have to switch this up. When you're looking at births, it's the lowest fertility rate, right? So the lowest number of births per woman of childbearing age from 15 to 44.
Right, that is 60.2, just so anybody knows.
Right, and it is the lowest level since the United States started keeping those records in the early 1900s. What's really interesting when you look through the numbers is that we had a decline in birth rates for each age group except those over 40.
Yeah.
Now, they had a very slight uptick, but they don't have a ton of children to begin with, and so it doesn't move the needle in terms of overall births. On the other end, being that every other group had a decline, teen births continues to fall. And so teen births is 50% lower than it was in 2007, and it's 70% lower or more, if I remember the number correctly, back to 1991, which was the peak. And so we've had this dramatic reduction in teen births, which is keeping births quite low, because that is a high, absolute number. And so part of it is you look at the economy, you look at what's going on with a group that tends to have more children, being the young adults coming out of college, and now they're saying, hey, we got a lot of student loans, and so we have other priorities to deal with. Part of it is saying, wait a second, are we just moving to where other nations have already been, being the Japanese, the Koreans, the Germans, where people get older and decide, you know what, I just don't want to do this. As a nation, they get older and say, we just don't want as many children. It's something to be concerned about, because even with our own work, we look at demographics and having children as the driving force to spending.
Right.
And when you don't have children, you remove that compulsion, and I mean compulsion, to spend money. And so you can choose as an adult with no children or few children to say, maybe I don't want to spend as much. And so that's a worry for economic growth. There is no doubt.
Yeah, well, if people are making a standard of living judgment on that sort of thing, well, that's short-sighted, isn't it?
Well, we think it is, but you have the flip side. There's a lot of people on the planet. I mean, this has been an issue for a long time. Should we be cutting down on the number of people? But the way we've set up our society and our economy is a growing workforce. There is no question that the developed nations of the world are all set up on the same principle, that you'll have a growing workforce to increase the tax base and be able to keep the economy going and to support the elderly in their retirement. And as we lower the number of births, we turn that on its head.
Absolutely. And over time, that translates into an aging society like we just talked about in Japan and Germany. And wow, there might be a connection between this sort of thing and low growth. You know, if
Just
only,
thinking.
if only
Just
somebody,
thinking.
maybe there was a group of people that figured this out and wrote about it every day and week, you know.
Maybe some guy, Harry something. I know there was a name. It just escapes me, but I can see it right in my mind's eye.
Well, if anybody listening can remember, maybe shoot us a line and we'll go find him. That's all the time we had for that topic. I made sure to give you all of your time, Rodney, on the birth thing, so I didn't want to step on you there. Looking ahead to next week, we've got new and existing home sales, durable goods, and then we're going to get minutes from the last Fed meeting. Anything else you're keeping your eye on for next week, Rodney?
No, just those who are investing and watching the markets, remember next week is the week before Memorial Day. Anybody who is anybody is going to be headed for the coast by Thursday, midday.
Yes.
And so whatever you think you need to get accomplished in the markets, make sure you do it early in the week, because Memorial Day is kind of the kickoff of summer, of course. And like I said,
Right.
the Jersey Turnpike and everything is going to be loaded. So by the end of the week, going to be deader than a doornail.
Yeah, absolutely. So we will be making our exits as well, but we will be here on Friday morning. Do not worry. The following week after that, I'll be away, and Rodney will be hosting the show on his own, which will be interesting to hear.
Yep.
But yeah, that's all the time we have. I want to thank you, Rodney, for coming on. I want to thank all of you for watching. Of course, you could find us on dentresearch.com and at economyandmarkets.com. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next week.